Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question's to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement that, quote, a credit downgrade of that sort would mean lenders would no longer see us as a good credit risk? They would be reluctant to lend us money, and when they did, they'd charge us ever higher interest rates. I don't want to see New Zealanders weighed down by that burden.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes, I do. Back in May 2009, when I made that statement, markets were very nervous about lending and a downgrade could have been damaging. We'd just seen Ireland downgraded from AAA to AA+, and their interest rates immediately rose 0.5% as a consequence. The global situation is now quite different, and the proof of that is in the bond yields in New Zealand today are unchanged from what they were a couple of weeks ago.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Who's telling the truth? Bill English, who recently told this House that there is, quote-unquote, no doubt that a credit downgrade would lead to higher interest rates, or the Prime Minister, who said yesterday that it wouldn't?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, both of us, and the question I was asked yesterday was whether I thought yields would rise, and in the short term I don't think they will. In fact, that's borne out by a graph of bond yields at the moment, which just shows it's incredibly consistent despite the downgrade.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, is the Prime Minister now saying to the House that the credit downgrade that he didn't see coming would lead to higher interest rates, as Bill English has already asserted as recently as Sunday?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, over time it might, and that's why New Zealand would always want to strive to have a higher credit rating rather than a lower one. And one of the commentaries here, the Westpac or ANZ's commentary, actually confirms that while the short-term impact is unlikely to see interest rates go up, over time it could do.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, does the Prime Minister still believe his statement to this House that a credit downgrade is, quote, the number one way to see New Zealanders down the road from their jobs, end quote?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
It would depend on the circumstances. I mean, if back in 2009 we'd received a credit downgrade in isolation, that would have been more troubling, arguably, than today when we've seen S&P downgrade 9 of the last 10 countries, when you've got a downgrade that's taking place because of the international environment and because the downgrade is a result of the fact that that weaker international environment is of concern of the stock of private sector debt. I must say, Mr Speaker, though, I would be interested in hearing the view of the Leader of the Opposition about whether he takes responsibility for that large build-up in private sector debt, because here is a list actually of the current account deficits run under the previous Labor government. What they show is they're incredibly high. They're often around about 8% of GDP. And, Mr Speaker, I remember in 1999 Michael Cullen saying the number one thing he would address was the current account deficit in New Zealand.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
When, for heaven's sake, is the Prime Minister going to accept any responsibility for the fact that the downgrading of New Zealand's credit rating by two agencies last Friday was the first downgrading of New Zealand in 13 years and came 3 years after he became Prime Minister?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, with the greatest respect, I'm not responsible for what happens in Europe and the United States. Nor technically was I in government when there was enormous build-up in private sector debt. What I can say, though, Mr Speaker, what I can say is both Fitch and Standard & Poor's actually have taken quite some trouble to actually mention in their press releases that the government and the books of the government and the pathway of the government is not only on the right track, but that if any future government was to unnecessarily place more debt on the economy, as Labor is proposing, that is likely to be a very bad thing indeed, Mr Speaker.
Chris Tremaine.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question to the Prime Minister. Has he seen any reports on the build-up in external debt over the last decade?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Funnily enough, yes, I've seen two such reports. One shows that New Zealand's net external debt rose from 64% of GDP in 2001 to 83% in 2008 because of huge and persistent current account deficits. The other report backs this up and says, quote, "I do not pretend either that our record was perfect, nor deny that there were significant questions unresolved. Our current account deficit was stubbornly high and the savings deficit was unsustainable. Productivity growth was too low." That, Mr. Speaker, was a frank and honest assessment, even if it came too late, from David Cunliffe at the Mood of the Boardroom.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when did a government spend $18 billion more than it earned in revenue in a single year, as this government is doing in this financial year?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, to the best of my knowledge, never. Although I haven't checked that, never. And I say to New Zealanders, that's a very telling question by Mr. Goff, because half of that deficit was for the rebuild of Christchurch. This party and this government stands for the rebuild of Christchurch. This party and this government stands for helping New Zealanders through tough economic times. The opposition does not, and that is a very telling statement 8 weeks out from an election.
Order. The House will come back to order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, is it correct that New Zealand's credit rating with those two agencies is now the same as Spain's, a country which the National Party has constantly derided as being an economy in trouble?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can't confirm that, but it may well be. It sounds logical. But let me quote this from Fitch. Okay, well, let me quote this from Fitch. New Zealand remains well placed among the world's highly rated sovereign credits. Its credit worthiness is supported by moderate public indebtedness, fiscal prudence and strong public institutions. But I will say this, Mr. Speaker, when Standard & Poor's were giving a meeting in New Zealand about a month ago, what they did say was there was about a 30% chance that we would be downgraded. And that's what happens when you're on negative outlook. They did go on to say, though, if there was a change of government, that downgrade would be much more likely.
The Honourable John Boscawen. Order. How can the member at the back of the House be heard asking his question? The Honourable John Boscawen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister is not responsible for what happens in the United States and Europe, does he accept that he and his government are responsible for public policy settings in New Zealand? And if so, how does he reconcile Standard & Poor's statement that one of the reasons for them lowering New Zealand's rating was, quote, emerging fiscal pressures associated with an ageing population, end quote, with his statement from the 19th of September that, quote, all of our forecasts, all our models build in a retirement age at 65. On the calculations, we have it as affordable.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes and yes.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, was it part of national strategy to avoid a credit downgrade by imposing 20% more tax on New Zealanders' spending, as Bill English suggested on Q&A? If so, has it worked?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, one of the policy initiatives that came out of the rebalancing of lowering personal taxes and increasing GST was actually to make it more, well, to actually give New Zealanders much greater choices, actually, to save or to pay off their mortgage, or do whatever they want to do. And the answer is yes, it has actually worked, because, funnily enough, New Zealanders are saving. They are saving more at the moment.
The Honourable John Boscawen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Prime Minister. Does he agree that increasing the retirement age beyond 65 would ease the, quote, emerging fiscal pressures associated with New Zealand's ageing population, close quote, as cited by Standard & Poor's? And if so, does he think New Zealand's credit downgrade proves his policy to not touch the retirement age is short-sighted?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in terms of the latter part of the question, no. I think it's quite clear from all of the statements made by both Fitch and S&P that the reason for the downgrade was because of the international environment being more fragile and because New Zealand had high levels of private sector indebtedness. In terms of the former, government's comfortable that the retirement age at 65 is affordable. It's modelled to 2025, and that's about as far out as we need to go.
Point of order, the Honourable John Boscawen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek leave of the House to table a statement by statement and pause, in which state, quote, the emerging fiscal pressures associated with the ageing population has led to New Zealand's credit downgrade.
Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? There's no objection. Question number 2. I beg your pardon, is this?
I seek leave to...
further point of order, the Honourable John Boscawen.
Point of order. Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker,
the Honourable John Boscawen.
I seek leave to table a statement from the Prime Minister on the 19th of September.
Order. Is this a press statement?
It's a statement from Mr. Key as quoted on the 3 News website.
On what site?
On the 3 News website.
We don't table statements off websites of the media. Question number 2, Pesidas Sam Lut.